What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another video. So now that the 2024-2025 season is underway, the Devils and the Sabres are 2 games into the season. Actual opening night is on Tuesday night. I thought it'd be a fun idea because I've talked about the offseason so much to put a little bow on it, especially now that we have the Jeremy Swayman extension. I actually filmed a lot of this yesterday before it. But now that we have that, everything for the most part, rosters are locked up outside of like guys maybe signing off PTOs. So we're going to go through it the entire offseason and give grades to every single team based on trades that they made, how their draft went, signings in terms of extensions to their own re-signings, and free agency signings. So without further ado, let's get into it. And up first, we have the Montreal Canadiens. I'm going to go with an A+. I'm not going to lie. When looking at it in the draft, getting Demidov at 5th overall, a guy with legit franchise superstar potential, was amazing. Michael Hage, another guy that maybe could eventually be their second-line center down the line, also has a shit ton of potential. Getting Patrick Laine, although he did get hurt, it's definitely more of a long-term play because the next 2 years he's making $8.7 million. They weren't really thinking in the short term. They needed him to be fantastic. And also they got a second-round pick for him. And in terms of the extensions, might honestly be better than the draft. When looking at Slavkovsky, locking him up at 8 years, $7.6 million. He just needs to be like an okay first liner to be worth that. He has legit 85 to 90 point potential, maybe even more. And Caden Gooley, 6 years, 5.5. He just needs to be an okay second pair defenseman, and he'll be well worth that deal. Next up, the LA Kings. I'm going to go with a B-, very much a mixed bag for the LA Kings. When looking at Liam Greentree in the draft, I thought that was very good value. Trades, Tanner Jeannot for a second and a fourth was a little bit confusing. It's good that they got off PLD in that trade, considering the fact that Darcy Kemper only has 3 years left and only makes 5.25. Overall, the PLD experience was horrible, but just this offseason, I think Rob Blake was smart to potentially move off that, and maybe Darcy Kemper can bounce back because they obviously need a legit starting goalie next season. In terms of the signings, the free agency signings, I don't like that much. Joel Edmondson, especially 4 years, $3.85 million. Warren Fogle, 3 years, 3.5. I don't think he's going to be putting up like 20 and 20 like he did last year when he doesn't have Draisaitl centering him. But when looking at the extensions, Byfield's extension was great. 5 years, $6.25 million. Jordan Spence, 2 years, 1.5. You're going to see how good Jordan Spence is this year, considering the fact that they don't have Drew Doughty to start the season. Next up, the Utah Hockey Club. A- for them when looking at Iginla, 6th overall. I wouldn't have taken him 6th overall, but I still have as like my number 10 prospect, so perfectly fine with that. In terms of trades, Sergachev definitely has some risk coming off that injury, but it's a risk that they kind of got to take, considering the fact that they're trying to take that next step, and Sean Durzi probably isn't a legit number 1 on a true playoff team, although I really like Sean Durzi, and we're going to talk about his contract very shortly. You got to take that risk if you're Sergachev, if you are the Utah Hockey Club, and they gave up Mosier, they gave up Geeky, which they have enough young forwards. Not saying Geeky's not a very good player. I really like that trade for Tampa as well, but it was a risk that they had to take. John Marino, 2 second-round picks. Going back to that prospect pool, they had enough of a loaded prospect pool that they don't really care about losing 2 second-round picks. And although Marino did have a bit of a down year last season with New Jersey, if he can return to 2023 form, he's going to be a damn good second-pair defenseman for the Utah Hockey Club. Their signings, Gunther, 8 years, $7.4 million. I'm very high on him. I think he has 40 and 40 potential. And then Sean Durzi, 4 years, $6 million. Again, definitely more so of a number 2 on an actual playoff team. Could give you around 40-ish points. At $6 million, that is perfectly reasonable. The Washington Capitals also get an A-. They might have been the most busy team this offseason when looking at it, starting off with the draft. Parasak was a little bit of a reach, but the fact that they got Cole Hudson in the second round kind of makes up for that. Overall, a pretty solid draft. When looking at the trades, PLD is risky, but he definitely has more upside, more potential to turn it around than a Darcy Kemper who's 34 years old. Will he ever be an $8.5 million guy again? Probably not, but can he be 7.5? I think it's possible. In terms of Mangiapane, wasn't that big on that trade, considering the fact that he makes $5.75 million and you gave up a second, didn't get any money retained, but he can definitely bounce back. And then in terms of the trades that I like, they gave up Beck Malestein, who wasn't really a core piece, for a second-round pick, and it was like 42nd overall. Thompson, the fact that they got him for 2 third-round picks, great value there. And Chychrun is obviously a talent upgrade over Nick Jensen. In terms of the signings, Matt Roy, 6 years, $5.75 million. I like that. As well as Connor McMichael on a 2-year deal at $2.1 million. I think if he finds his way on that second line left wing, he's going to be worth like $4.2 million next season. The Anaheim Ducks, C+. It really just boils down to the Beckett Seneca draft pick, considering the fact 3rd overall, you had Lindstrom on the board, you had Demidov on the board. You go outside the box, maybe Verbeek is right. Maybe Verbeek is an amazing scouter, considering the fact that he hit on some other guys recently. recently that we thought he was crazy for taking. On top of that, Solberg, I do like that. That's giving them more so a C+. If it was just Seneca, might have been like a C or a C-. In terms of trades, they got Fabry, they got Dumoulin. They're going to be middle of the roster, lower end players, so it's really not that big, and they didn't really give up that much to get them. And in terms of signings, they didn't do really jack shit. So again, C+, mainly just because I'm not too high in the Beckett Seneca draft pick in the 2024 draft. Next up, we got the Nashville Predators. I'm going to go with a B+. They definitely went for it this offseason, up first in the draft. To get Jaeger Surin, I was decently high on him, as well as Teddy Stiga at like 47th overall or something like that. Was very good value in the draft in terms of trades. Askarov, getting a first-round pick for him after he openly wanted out is very good value, and I believe it's Vegas's first-round pick, so that could be decently high. Ryan McDonough's deal was a little bit confusing at the time, but the fact that they cleared his money to bring in a guy like Brady Shea, then it makes more sense in my opinion, and they also got, I think, a second or third-round pick for that. And then in terms of the signings, I don't love the term on it, but I do like Nashville kind of going for it over these next 2 to 3 years. They're in this weird phase, but they just decided to go for it instead of maybe just doing really nothing this offseason or completely blowing it up. So, although I don't like Stamkos at $8 million, I don't love Brady Shea getting 7 years. I like the Marchessault deal a decent amount. But next year, they are going to be a pretty scary team. The Ottawa Senators, I'm going to go with a B, another very mixed bag team. When looking at it, Yakimchuk at 7th overall, didn't like it on draft night. He's balling out in the preseason. He has like 7 points in 4 games, but still, I think that was a little bit too high. In terms of trades, Olmark deal was fantastic. They attached the 3rd-round pick to Matthew Joseph, which I didn't think was that good of value. I think he's a pretty okay player, only making like $3 million. And then the Chychrun deal, I hate it in the moment, but I think that Jensen might be a better fit. Chychrun's definitely more talented, but they did need more so of a veteran defensive right hand. So I still think they lost that deal, but it's not the end of the world. In terms of signings, Perron, fine, 2 years, $4 million. Amadio, I think, is actually a pretty solid deal at 3 years, 2.6. And then they got Shane Pinto on a solid bridge deal at 2 years, 3.75. So yeah, Yakimchuk was a little bit of a head scratcher, but maybe he pans out. He has the offensive potential too. And they definitely lost the Chychrun one, but the Olmark deal is by far outweighs everything. And as a result, I'm going to give them a B. The Calgary Flames, they get an A. I thought they really hit it out of the park this offseason, especially that goddamn draft. Zane Perrick at 9th. You get Matt Gridden, who led the entire USHL in scoring. Andrew Basha at 42nd overall, I think. Henry Muse at 74th or in the 70s. And then Misa at 150th. It was the most impressive draft, I'd say. I think San Jose probably had the best draft, but they had a lot more higher up picks than the first overall pick. But when looking at it, they got value at basically every single draft selection. In terms of the trades, again, getting a second-round pick for Mangiapane at that price point, considering the fact the last 2 years he's only been around the 40-point guy. Very good value. Markstrom, some people didn't like that trade. Again, Markstrom is pretty goddamn inconsistent. So to get a first-round pick, and they retain money, they have like $20 million in cap space. So them retaining $2 million, they can do that, and they got that first overall pick. First round pick, not the first overall pick. And then in terms of signings, they got a guy like Anthony Mantha that I think that they're going to flip at the deadline for like a second or a third round pick. They also brought in guys like Ryan Lumberg and Jake Bean for kind of depth, veteran, more so veteran experienced guys. But when looking at the Calgary Flames, this was a very solid offseason for their future. The Toronto Maple Leafs, I'm going to go with a B-. When looking at it, Danford in the draft, I thought it was a little bit of a reach, but also I said that about Easton Cowan. So I'm going to not be too critical of that, considering Easton Cowan was fantastic last year. Trades, it was smart to get ahead of Chris Tanev to trade for his rights and then negotiate that deal. In terms of the actual signings, they definitely gave Tanev and OEL too much term. The AAV is like okay for the next 2 to 3 years. I think those guys are definitely going to improve their defense core. In terms of the goaltending, I think getting Stolars at 2 years, 2.5 is a very good deal. Joseph Wool, 3 years, 3.66. Domi, 3 years, 3.75. And Liljegren, 2 years, $3 million is like perfectly fine. It's an okay offseason. I'm not really blown away by any stretch. And they got some value in some of their deals, but some other deals are a little bit of a head scratch. So when looking at it, I think a B- is fair. For the Toronto Maple Leafs, next up, the San Jose Sharks. They get an A when looking at their draft. Celebrini, Dickinson, Igor Chernyshov, and Leo Salin Wallenius. Amazing top 4 to get out of this draft, so I really like that. Askarov, they did give up a decent amount, but again, they have the best prospect pool in the NHL right now. They can trade their first-round pick that they got from Vegas. Obviously, it's not their own first-round pick. The Cody Ceci trade was a little bit confusing, considering the fact that they only got a third-round pick to help out a team that was cap tight, and they gave up Ty Emberson, who I think can be a decent player. That's one trade that I didn't really like that much, but they also got a second-round pick to take on Jake Wallman. I really like that that deal. He's going to play serious minutes next year for that team. In terms of their signings, Toffoli, definitely too many years with 4 years, but he's going to be worth 6.25 the next year or two, and especially mentoring those young guys, giving those young centers someone that can still put up 30 and 30 for the most part. That's very good. And Wenberg, definitely too much AAV at $5 million, but it's only a 2-year deal, so I don't hate those veteran signings that they made. Very good offseason for the San Jose Sharks. Next up for my New York Islanders, I'm going to go with an A-. Didn't make like franchise massive altering moves, but I think they hit on most of their moves. When looking at the draft, they got Yzerman, who was arguably the steal of the draft. Even if you weren't that high on Yzerman at 20th overall, that was good value, as well as a guy like Jesse Pulkkinen that's 6'6", was very solid last year over in Finland. Bednarik was good with the U.S. developmental program. In terms of trades, the only trade that they made was going from 18 to 50th, or 18th to 20th, and they still got Yzerman despite trading back from 18th to 20th on top of picking a second-round pick that they ended up getting Bednarik with, so very good value in that deal. And in terms of their signings, Anthony Duclair, 4 years, $3.5 million. I think we can agree is very good value, considering the fact how he looked at the end of the season with Tampa Bay, on top of if he can return to his Florida days during the full season, you could have a 30 and 30 guy on your hands if he's playing on that top line. And getting Maxim Soplakov, the #1 KHL and overall European free agent this summer, to get him to Long Island is very impressive. Even if he's not some absolute stud, even if he's just a good third liner, again, you just completely got him out of nowhere for $900K. Good value there. Again, maybe not the biggest franchise altering moves, but I think the New York Islanders basically hit on everything, and as a result, they get an A-. The Florida Panthers, B+. When looking at it, they only got Linus Eriksson in the first 3 rounds. Trades didn't really make any. In terms of signings, you knew that they were going to lose Montour and probably Tarasenko. So the fact that they got pretty solid value in deals like Schmidt, Kulikov, and Boquist were very good for the Florida Panthers. And on top of that, their extensions, re-signing of Sam Reinhart, 8 years, $8.6 million. Very good value there, as well as Lundell, 6 years, $5 million. If you can get back on track, that is going to be an absolute steal. And as a result, I'm going to go with the B+ for the Florida Panthers. The Seattle Kraken, the team that I'm actually repping right now, they get a C. I like the Berkeley Cat in selection at 8th overall, though I think they probably should have went with defensemen. They have like no top-end defenseman prospects, but still, Berkeley Cat was like my number 6 or number 7 prospect on the board. In terms of trades, they dumped Dumoulin, but again, that made sense considering the fact that Riker Evans is probably going to take a full-time role next season. In terms of signings, the Montour deal, I don't hate it considering the fact that he does have this experience and did have a 70-point season 2 years ago. Don't love it, though. But when looking at Stevenson, 7 years, $6.25 million, that's a pretty shit signing. As well as Adam Larson's extension, 4 years, 5.25, kicks in when he's like 34 years old. Don't like that. The RFA deals were pretty solid with Beniers, 7 years, 7.14. In Tolvanen, 2 years, 3.475. The Vegas Golden Knights, I'm going to go with the C+ when looking at them in the draft. Actually got a very solid player in Trevor Conley at 19th overall, by far their best prospect in the system right now. Trades, Thompson was a little bit tough considering he wanted out, but still only 2 third-round picks is kind of disappointing. They got Alexander Holtz, who maybe could have some upside. I don't believe in him as much as others. I think others just see 7th overall, not what he's done. But when looking at the signings, they lost a bunch of guys, but that was kind of expected. But even the guys that they brought in to kind of replace them are a little bit disappointing. Guys like Samsonov and Olofsson, they're bargain hunting on guys that didn't even have that good of seasons last year. So as a result, I got to go with the C+ here. Detroit, I'm going to go with a B-. Michael Brandsegg-Nygaard at 15th overall with solid value. They also got Max Plant at 47th. Solid draft for them. In terms of trades, dumping Wallman still like boggles my mind considering he was only making like 3.5. The fact you had to attach a 2nd-round pick to that, as well as dumping Robbie Fabry, but I don't really care much about the Fabry one. In terms of signings, they signed a bunch of veterans that like suggested they're trying to win next season and really go for it with Tarasenko, Gustafsson, Talbot, and re-signing Kane. I do like the extension of Lucas Raymond at 8 years, $8.07 million. Mort Seider, the jury is still out on him, but 7 years, $8.55. If he takes that next step next year, could be very good value, a B- for Detroit. For the Columbus Blue Jackets, I feel kind of like insensitive giving a grade, obviously, because of the tragedy. So I'm just going to highlight some of the good things within their offseason. Lindstrom at 4th overall was good value. I think he has legit franchise potential. And then their extensions to some of their RFAs. Chinnikov, 2 years, 2.1. He was very good for them last year. Sillinger, 2 years, 2.5. He got back on track this season. Kent Johnson, 3 years, 1.8. If he really pops, that's going to be a fantastic deal. And Marchenko, 3 years, $3.85 million. The Tampa Bay Lightning, although I had them missing the playoffs in my predictions, I really like their offseason. I'm going to give them an A. They didn't have any draft picks. They had no first, second, or third round pick. But in terms of the trades, I like the McDonough pickup. Obviously familiar with John Cooper, and he didn't give up a ton to get him. They got a second and a fourth round pick for Tanner Jeannot somehow. I would not have predicted that. The Sergachev move, I think it just makes a lot of sense considering Hedman is still that number one on that team. They still got a young guy in Mosier who's not going to be as good as Sergachev, obviously, but can play serious minutes. They got Connor Geekie, who's a very good forward prospect, and they don't have a ton of prospects, ton of cost-controlled guys in their bottom six that can take that next step and improve from within, as well as, I believe, getting a second-round pick. So I like the deal, the Sergachev deal for them. Trading for Gensel's rights ahead of time and then signing him to an 7 or 8 year deal at $9 million. Very good value there, especially for a team that really only gives a shit about the next 3 to 4 years. And then JJ Mosier, also 2 years, $3.375. Decent second pair guy. That's about a fair deal. Victor Hedman extension is a little bit risky considering he's starting to get up there in age, but as long as he's a good top pair offensive defenseman that can get you 70 to 75 points at $8 million, that is perfectly fine. The Winnipeg Jets, I'm going to go with a B for the Jets, although they obviously lost Monahan and Toffoli. I still thought they had a really good offseason when looking at it. Alphonse Frey at 37th overall, very good value there. Rucker McGrody wanted out, so the fact that they were able to get a prospect that was on the same level, some maybe even prefer him over McGrody, and Braden Yeager was a very good trade by Cheveldayoff. In terms of the signings, DeMello, 4 years, $4.9 million. Perfectly fine for a guy that's been a good top pair defenseman for them. On top of Perfetti's bridge deal, I hope that I wish that they win a little bit longer, but 2 years, $3.25 million. I fully expect him to be a $5 to $6 million player during the duration of that contract. The Carolina Hurricanes, this might surprise some people. I'm going to go with an A. Although they are a worse team, I really like their offseason. They got Badinka at 34th overall, good value there. A steal right now in Nikita Artemanov at 50th overall. The dude had 23 points in 54 games in the KHL last year. I looked it up. It was the third most productive in terms of points per game in a KHL draft year. Only Michkov and Tarasenko are ahead of him. And this year he has 11 goddamn points in 12 games to start the KHL season. And then in terms of the trades, they traded a Gensel away. They got a third round pick. They couldn't afford him, so just pick up a third round pick. Solid value there. In terms of the signings, although again, they lost Pesci, they lost Brady Shea, I really like the Walker and Gothisbehere deals. I think considering the fact that what those other guys got, I maybe would even prefer Sean Walker and Gothisbehere, although yeah, definitely Pesci and Shea are better players. But when looking at those deals, Natchez, 2 years, 6.5, perfectly fine with that. Seth Jarvis's 8 year, $7.4 million contract, in my opinion, is the best contract that was signed this offseason in terms of an extension. He is an absolute stud. Slavin, 8 years, 6.4, another goddamn steal. A guy like him, I think, is going to age very well. Chatfield, 3 years, $3 million. I think he's a very underrated player just because he plays on that bottom pair, and as well as keeping guys like Jordan Martinuk, bringing in a guy like Carrier. So when looking at it, although they probably are a worse team, that's because last year they had so many guys on cheap deals that were hitting unrestricted free agency. They went for it with Jake Gensel. This is going to be a very good team next year still, and as a result of this good offseason. The Chicago Blackhawks, they get a B-. I honestly wasn't that high on their draft when looking at it. All 3 of their first-round picks, I think, were taken a little bit earlier than I probably would have. I wasn't that high on Leshinov. Still solid, and I really like their third-round pick, AJ Spellacy. The guy is an absolute beast athlete. He was like he got D1 offers in football at like 15, 16, then fully chose hockey. Clearly was the right choice considering he got drafted in the third round. In terms of trades, I like them taking on Ilya Mikheyev for a second-round pick. They did give up a fourth-round pick in that deal, but still utilizing their cap space. Signings, I like the fact that they brought in some veterans like TJ Brody, Martinez, Bertuzzi, Teravainen, Lauren Brossois. But when looking at it with the Chicago Blackhawks, obviously the draft is what matters most. I didn't like their draft that much, so as a result, they only get a B-. The Buffalo Sabres, they get a D+, and I am not factoring in the fact that they started 0-2 in the season, lost 2 games to the New Jersey Devils. I love what they did in the draft. They got Constant Helenius. He was my number 5 or number 6 prospect in the entire draft. I don't like their trades when looking at it. Beck Malestein for a second-round pick, as well as Matthew Savoy. I know they have a shit ton of young forward prospects, but to give up a guy with legit top 6 potential for Ryan McLeod, who's like at best like a third liner. I didn't really like that value in that. The signings were okay. UPL could maybe have some value at 5 years, $4.75 million. Henry Ukiharu, $3.1 million. Zucker, $5 million. You give Jason Zucker a 1 year, $5 million deal, as well as Sam Lafferty, 2x2. They brought out Jeff Skinner. You thought they were going to make this big splash considering they got a shit ton of cap space from that buyout. They didn't really do dick. They still have like $6 million in cap space right now. Why the fuck did you buy out Jeff Skinner? Now you're going to have that on your books after this season for 5 more years instead of 2 more years. Didn't really make a ton of sense, and I think Kevin Adams is probably going to get fired this year as a result. The St. Louis Blues, I got them with a C+. I wasn't too high in the Adam Jiricek draft pick, not David. Adam Jiricek at 16th. He was like my 24th or 25th best prospect. I didn't hate it, but I wasn't that high on it. In terms of trades, they got Matthew Joseph, picked up a 3rd-round pick. I thought that was pretty solid, but then they traded away Kevin Hayes and attached a 2nd-round pick. Like, St. Louis, you're not in the position to be attaching like decent draft assets, and then they had to get that 2nd-round pick in order to do the Broberg, which was also an overpayment with that offer sheet. I didn't like the Broberg offer sheet. I like the Dylan Holloway one a decent amount, but when looking at it, the Broberg one is just $4.6 million. I know it's more so thinking long-term, but again, not a fan of that. The Buchnevich extension was pretty solid though, 6 years, $8 million. Not too high in the Blues offseason. As a result, they get a C+. The Philadelphia Flyers, I'm going to go with a C. Although Luchenko might be playing at the NHL level to start this year, still don't like that pick. Still don't like the fact that they traded back one spot and let the Minnesota Wild take Zeev Boyum. I thought they needed a franchise-level defenseman, potential franchise-level defenseman like Zeev Boyum. I didn't like that move. In terms of signings, they locked up Travis Konecny on an 8-year deal at $8.75 million. That is a lot of goddamn money to give a guy. You look at a guy like Sam Reinhart, although Reinhardt's only a year older. Reinhart only got 8.625. So when looking at it, I think they overpaid a little bit for Travis Konecny. Not too big on the Philadelphia Flyers offseason. They get a C. The New Jersey Devils, they get an A. Again, not trying to glaze them after this 2-0 start. I have been very complimentary of Tom Fitzgerald's work this offseason. First off, bringing in Sheldon Keefe, I thought was a very good hiring. In terms of the draft, Salayev at 10th overall, very good value. Gets that more physical beast defenseman. They have a bunch of offensive guys. We saw today Seamus Casey get that goddamn monster back there. It's going to be locked down. Yegorov is a solid goalie prospect. They got him at 49th. The trades, Markstrom, you gave up a first-round pick, but again, you needed to fix that goaltending position, and I think Markstrom at $4.1 million is very solid value. You got 2 second-round picks for John Marino, which again, with your young guys coming up, he was very expendable and just wasn't that good for your team in 2024. And then in terms of your signings, you bring in guys like Brendan Dillon and Brett Pesce, veteran defensemen that have playoff experience, as well as bridging Dawson Mercer on a 3-year deal at $4 million that I think is going to be very damn good value. It was a great offseason by the New Jersey Devils. Colorado Avalanche, they didn't do much, but I'm going to give them a B+. When looking at it, Ilya Nabokov was the goaltender that they selected at 38th overall. He was my number 1 goaltender, and they traded back from the first round, I think, with Utah, and they still got an absolute stud in net that they're going to need down the line. He's an older guy. He's like 20, 21, so I think he's actually going to be ready relatively soon. KHL proven, so I really like that move, especially for their team. In terms of trades, that was really the only trade that they made moving back in the draft. In terms of signings, you look at it, a guy like Logan O'Connor has been pretty big for them within that bottom 6-year deal at 2.5. Maybe a little bit too much term on that, but it's going to be great value the first 2 to 3, 3 to 4 years, as well as re-signing Jonathan Drouin at $2.5 million. Great value there. Brought in guys like Brandstrom and DeHaan on sub $1 million deals. I think that's going to be big for their bottom pair, as well as Casey Middlestat on a very good bridge deal, 3 years, $5.75 million. That is going to be great value for a guy that gives you around 60 points. The Pittsburgh Penguins, I'm going to go with the C- in terms of the draft. Harrison Brunicki and Tanner Howe, okay in the second round. Nothing really that pops out. They got Rucker McGrody. That was definitely a positive. They took advantage of that situation. They got a 2nd and a 3rd round pick for Kevin Hayes and Cody Glass to take on their deals. But again, you have Sidney Crosby. You have this old core. Why are you like taking on shit contracts? Either fucking rebuild or don't. I don't know. They're just in a very weird spot. The signings, Crosby, 2 years, $8.7 million. Then they're like aggressive, like win now moves were Matt Grzelcyk, Anthony Beauvillier, and Blake Lizotte. They're just like the actual moves are not worthy of a C-. It's more so like what the fuck is the direction of this team? Like, I don't know. They're just in this really weird spot, and as a result, I'm going to go with a C-. The Minnesota Wild, they get a B when looking at it. Zeev Boyum at 12th overall to be aggressive to trade up one spot because you don't want that guy taken. He is fantastic, especially as a left side defenseman, can be their eventual top power play quarterback, maybe even play on the same pair with Brock Faber. They also got Ryder Ritchie in the second and took a risk on Aaron Kiviharyu in the fourth. By the time the fourth, you might as well take a risk on a guy that 2 years ago was the consensus first overall pick. So I really like their draft. Trades, they got Jacob Lauko. It doesn't remove me that much. In terms of their signings, I like the Faber extension, but I really hate the Yakov Trenin deal. 4 years, $3.5 million. And I think Middleton also got overpaid a little bit. So besides the free agency moves, I really like what they did, but those free agency moves definitely moved them down a little bit, and as a result, they get a B. The Edmonton Oilers, they get an A, although I don't like the guy that they hired as a general manager. They objectively had a fantastic offseason. Don't love the fact during the draft, actually, that they traded their 2025 first for Sam O'Reilly, who wasn't even like this guy that was slipping massively, but whatever, they'll just trade their 2026 first at this year's deadline or something like that. In terms of trades, though, other trades, Ryan McLeod for Savoy. Again, McLeod was stuck in a fourth line role. Matthew Savoy, different timeline. You just keep him in the AHL for a year or two, and he can have legit top six potential once you no longer have guys like Arvidsson and Jeff Skinner, as well as dumping Cody Ceci for only attaching a third-round pick and getting a guy like Ty Emberson that could potentially be their second pair right-hand defense, as well as Broberg. Yeah, you do not match that offer sheet. I think they probably should have with Dylan Holloway, but again, it's not a massive loss. Similar to Ryan McLeod, he's kind of stuck within that bottom six and more so that fourth line. So as a result, I don't mind that they didn't match both sheets. In terms of their signings, they got Draisaitl extended. Definitely not a team-friendly deal by any stretch, but they got it out of the way, and he is a superstar. Who cares? $14 million. He's worth it. Skinner and Arvidsson, though, those were great short-term deals that I think are really going to pay off. Playing with the Leon Draisaitl, they're probably going to have massive numbers. Re-signing Adam Henrique is a move that I keep bringing up that nobody else is talking about. Getting a legit third-line center that has been around 50, 55-point pace the last couple of years, as well as re-signing a lot of your bottom sixers like Janmark, like Perry, like Connor Brown. It was a fantastic offseason for the Edmonton Oilers. For the Boston Bruins, even though they just locked up Jeremy Swayman, I'm going to be a little bit tough on them. I'm going to go with the C- when looking at it. The Ullmark trade, that was a pretty brutal haul. Yes, they got a first-round pick, but they had to take on 75% of Korpisalo, who's obviously a massive downgrade compared to Ullmark. Zadorov and Lindholm, just a little bit too much money and definitely too much term on a 6-year deal and a 7-year deal to guys that are 29 years old. Although I think that they might be successful next year. It's not because of those signings that they made. In terms of Swayman, it's perfectly fine. Reasonable deal, $8.25 million. If he continues to produce like a top 10 goalie, it's going to be a very good contract, but it's not some like cheap bridge deal or like a 4 to 5 year deal at 7.5 where you're saving some serious money. So it's fine, but overall, yeah, I'm not too big on the Boston Bruins. They drafted Dean Letourneau, high upside guy, but it's going to take a long time, in my opinion, to get NHL ready, considering the fact that he's just like so raw right now. So a little bit disappointed by the Boston Bruins this offseason. And obviously the public comments with Swayman, that's just got messy, and as a result, kind of they've been the class of the NHL for the last couple of years, so to have that kind of public spout was not good. The Vancouver Canucks, I get called the Vancouver Canucks hater all the time. I'm going to give him an A-. I thought they had a very good offseason. They didn't have any top 90 picks. I do like that they took Anthony Romani, who's like an overager by 2 years, but the guy had 58 goals, 53 assists, 111 points last year. Might as well take a risk on him. Trades, they dumped Mikheyev. They got a 4th-round pick. They give up a 2nd-round pick, but they still got a 4th-round pick up. So to dump the last 2 years of that deal, I think it's like $4.75 million. Good on them for doing that instead of having to buy him out and having that stretched out. When looking at it, they also got a 4th-round pick for Pod Colson. It was time to get rid of him. He just wasn't working out on the team. With the signings, Phil Pronik, 8 years, $7.25 million. Not a great deal, not a bad deal, kind of in the middle on that. But when looking at other deals, Joshua, Bluger, Myers, all re-signed at perfectly good cap hits for the Vancouver Canucks. They're bringing back most of the same team outside of Lindholm, as well as Lindholm and Zadorov, and they're bringing in a guy like Jake DeBrusk at only $5.5 million. I think he has 30 and 30 potential, maybe even more if he plays with Pettersson. And then they also got guys like Sprong and Lankinen late into the season for under $1 million. Big depth pieces, especially a guy like Lankinen, considering the fact that Demko's health, we don't know exactly how it's going to go. The Dallas Stars, I'm going to go with a B when looking at it with the draft. Emil Hemming, 30th overall, perfectly fine pick. The trades, they dumped Radek Fasca's 1 year at $3.25 million for future considerations. That was very good value, as well as dumping Ty Dellandrea for a 4th-round pick. He just didn't really have a role on the team that much. The signings are a massive mixed bag. Again, the re-signings and extensions. Duchesne, 1 year, $3 million. Fantastic. Thomas Harley, 2 years, $4 million. I thought a 2-year deal would be like a $6 million AAV. But when looking at the free agency signings, Lyubushkin, Yikes. As well as Dumba to replace to replace Chris Tanev. One of them has to replace Chris Tanev. It's going to be rough. Their right side is looking pretty goddamn brutal, and as a result, they get a B. And then lastly, I have the New York Rangers. Now I'm going to go with the B. EJ Emery is kind of what that team needs, more so of a physical, big defensive defenseman down the line. I think he could be NHL ready in a couple seasons. In terms of trades, Riley Smith for a second-round pick, perfectly fine when looking at it. He's definitely not like a legit star right wing number one, but he's definitely an upgrade over what they were rolling out last year. And then the signings were okay. Lindgren, 1 year, 4.5. Schneider, 2 years, 2.2. Kakko, 1 year, 2.4. It's a B. You're not too moved by that. You're maybe a little bit disappointed that they didn't go after a big fish, but it's perfectly fine. They should safely be a playoff team next year. But let me know in the comments, what do you think about these off-season grades? Who was I too harsh on? Who was I too light on? I'll be seeing you in the next one.